I learned on a Tuesday afternoon that being strong was my family's excuse for loving me less. The law office smelled like expensive leather and old money, the kind of place where life-changing decisions happen behind closed doors. I sat in one of those high-backed chairs that made you feel small, watching my mother smooth down her navy blazer for the third time. My father cleared his throat, that particular sound he made when he was about to deliver news he'd already decided was final. Across from me, my brother Ethan slouched in his seat, refusing to meet my eyes. I had driven 3 hours from Portland for this meeting, taking a personal day from my job as a marketing coordinator at Sundale Financial. My studio apartment, small but meticulously organized, would be waiting for me when I got back, along with the presentation I needed to finish for Thursday's client meeting. I had built my life brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck, and I was proud of that fact. I thought my parents were proud too. I was wrong. My mother spoke first, her voice carrying that particular tone of rehearsed compassion that immediately put me on edge. "Scarlett, your father and I have been thinking very carefully about how to distribute our estate. We wanted to have this conversation now, while we're both healthy, so there are no surprises later." I nodded, my hands folded neatly in my lap. David Miller, our family attorney, sat at the head of the conference table with a stack of documents in front of him. He'd been handling our family's legal matters for over 20 years. I remembered him giving me candy from a crystal bowl in his office when I was 7 years old. "We've decided," my father continued, his gray eyes fixed somewhere over my left shoulder, "to allocate $15 million from our estate to Ethan. We feel that he needs the financial support more than you do, Scarlett. You've always been so capable, so independent. You've built a good life for yourself without any help from us." The words landed like physical blows. I felt my face go cold, then hot, then cold again. My fingers gripped the armrests of my chair until my knuckles turned white. $15 million. The entirety of my parents' liquid assets, as far as I knew. Everything they'd saved, invested, and grown over 4 decades of marriage. And I was getting nothing. "Wait," I said, my voice coming out sharper than I intended. "What about my share?" My mother's perfectly manicured hand reached across the table as if to comfort me, but stopped halfway. "Sweetheart, you have to understand. Ethan's restaurant has been struggling. He's had such a difficult time finding his footing, and we want to give him the security to finally succeed. You, on the other hand, you've always been self-sufficient. You don't need our money." The words felt like a slap wrapped in silk. I looked at Ethan, really looked at him, trying to find some sign of protest, some indication that he thought this was as insane as I did. But he just stared at his hands, his jaw tight, saying nothing. "Being strong isn't a punishment," I said, fighting to keep my voice level. "And independence doesn't mean I don't deserve support from my family." My father leaned forward, his expression a mixture of parental concern and immovable certainty. "Scarlett, look at everything you've accomplished. You put yourself through college with scholarships and part-time jobs. You got that position at Sundale on your own merit. You pay your own rent, your own bills. You don't need us to prop you up the way Ethan does. That's something to be proud of." I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the massive mahogany table and watch all those neat legal documents scatter across the floor. Instead, I forced myself to breathe, to think, to remember that I was in a law office, not a boxing ring. But the memories came flooding back anyway. All those times Ethan had failed and been given another chance. The restaurant before this one that had gone bankrupt. The tech startup that never made it past the planning phase. The brief stint as a real estate agent that ended with him owing money to his broker. Each time, my parents had been there with open checkbooks and encouraging words about how failure was just a stepping stone to success. And me? I'd been given expectations. High ones. Expectations that I would meet them without stumbling, without asking for help, without ever admitting that I was tired of carrying everything alone. David Miller began explaining the legal framework, his voice a drone of technical terms and procedural details. I barely heard him. My mind had drifted to my grandmother, Victoria Caldwell, who had passed away 18 months earlier. She had been a formidable woman, a businesswoman who had built a small empire in real estate back when women were supposed to be content with marriage and children. She had been the only person in my family who seemed to truly see me, not as strong Scarlett who didn't need anything, but as a human being with dreams and fears and needs just like everyone else. "Strength is a gift, Scarlett," she'd told me once, her weathered hands holding mine across her kitchen table. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Don't let them punish you for being capable." I hadn't understood what she meant at the time. Now, sitting in this law office, watching my parents hand my brother everything while giving me their pride and expectations, I understood perfectly. Something else nagged at the back of my mind. My grandmother had been meticulous about her affairs. I remembered visiting her a few months before she died, and she'd mentioned updating documents with David Miller. Several times she'd mentioned it. She'd looked at me with those sharp gray eyes and said something cryptic about making sure certain truths couldn't be buried. I glanced at David Miller, who was organizing papers with careful precision. He looked uncomfortable, I realized. Not just professionally distant, but actually uncomfortable. Is there something else? I heard myself ask. My mother checked her watch. Is that everything, David? We have dinner reservations at 7. David Miller hesitated. It was barely a pause, just a fraction of a second. But I caught it. His eyes met mine, and something passed between us. An apology, maybe. Or a warning. Actually, he said slowly, there is one more matter. The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. My father stiffened. My mother's hand froze on her purse. Ethan finally looked up, his expression wary. David pulled out another folder, thicker than the first. I apologize for the oversight, but Victoria Caldwell left very specific instructions about timing that I'm only now fully understanding. What kind of instructions? My mother's voice had gone tight. It appears that Mrs. Caldwell established a separate trust many years ago, managed independently of the family estate. He withdrew a thick manila envelope from the folder, sealed with wax. I recognized my grandmother's distinctive handwriting on the front. For Scarlett to be opened only in the presence of legal counsel and after Eleanor and Richard have made their inheritance intentions clear. My hands shook as I reached for the envelope. The paper was heavy, expensive, the kind my grandmother had always preferred. The wax seal bore her initials. Victoria never mentioned any separate arrangements to us, my father said, and I heard fear beneath the indignation. Are you certain these documents are legitimate? Completely certain, David replied. Mrs. Caldwell was very thorough. She updated these documents multiple times over the past 5 years, always with witnesses and proper notarization. I broke the wax seal. Inside were documents, bank statements, property deeds, and a handwritten letter. Photographs fell out, old ones from my childhood, and jewelry I remembered my grandmother wearing. But it was the property documents that made my breath catch. My mother leaned forward, trying to see. What is all that? I picked up the letter, my grandmother's elegant cursive filling 3 pages of cream-colored stationery. My voice shook as I began to read aloud. My dearest Scarlett, if you are reading this letter, then I trust that your parents have shown their true colors regarding the family inheritance. I have watched for many years as they favored Ethan while taking your strength for granted. This ends now. The silence in the room was absolute. I could hear the clock on the wall ticking, the sound of traffic outside, my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I continued reading. 25 years ago, I established a trust in your name. Initially funded with money from my first business ventures and grown through careful investment over decades. Additionally, I am leaving you my properties in Seattle, including the apartment building I purchased in 1995 and the commercial space downtown. The current value of these assets exceeds $8 million. My mother made a sound like a wounded animal. Ethan's head snapped up, his eyes wide. My father gripped the edge of the table. But my grandmother wasn't finished. I've also documented every conversation I overheard about your parents' intentions regarding the family money. Eleanor and Richard have been planning to exclude you from any significant inheritance for over 2 years, believing that your independence means you need less support. They discussed this extensively during family dinners when they thought I was dozing in my chair. I looked up from the letter to see my parents' faces drained of color. Is this true? My mother opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came out. David Miller stepped in, spreading more documents across the table. Mrs. Caldwell also left detailed financial records. She tracked every dollar of financial support that Eleanor and Richard gave to Ethan over the past decade. The total exceeds $400,000 in gifts, loans, and investments that were never repaid. Victoria had no right to track our private family matters, my father said, but his voice lacked conviction. Actually, David replied calmly, she had every right to track how her own contributions to your family were distributed. It seems Mrs. Caldwell provided significant financial support to your household over many years, money she expected would benefit both children equally. I returned to the letter, my voice stronger now. Your parents received nearly $2 million from me over the past 15 years, funds I gave them with the clear understanding that it would secure both of my grandchildren's futures. Instead, they systematically channeled resources to Ethan while convincing themselves that you needed less because you were more capable. I turned to face my mother directly, and the fury in my chest had crystallized into something cold and hard. Is this true? Did you take Grandma's money and only use it for Ethan? My father tried to deflect. Victoria was generous with our family. We used that money for living expenses, home improvements, emergencies. Ethan's business failures are not family emergencies, I said, my voice cutting through the room like a blade. His bad investments are not living expenses. Ethan finally spoke, his voice small. Scarlett, I didn't know about all of this. Didn't you? I shot back. You didn't notice that every time you failed, Mom and Dad were there with their checkbook? You didn't see that I was working 3 jobs to put myself through college while you got your tuition paid in full? You never once wondered why the rules were different for us. He had no answer for that. David Miller cleared his throat. There's more in Mrs. Caldwell's documentation. She hired a private investigator 6 months before her death to verify her suspicions about the family's financial arrangements. He handed me another thick folder marked Confidential Investigation. Inside were photographs, bank statements, detailed reports about money flowing through our family. But it was the next revelation that broke the fragile peace in the room. The investigator also uncovered something interesting about Ethan's current business situation, David said, his tone neutral. It appears that your restaurant has actually been profitable for the past 18 months. The financial difficulties you've described to your parents have been greatly exaggerated. I turned to stare at Ethan, and I watched him crumble under my gaze. Is this true? He couldn't look at me. It's complicated. There were cash flow issues, and I needed capital for expansion. So you lied to our parents about being in financial trouble? The question hung in the air like smoke. I didn't exactly lie. I just presented the worst-case scenario. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. Complete betrayal. Not only have Mom and Dad favored you my entire life, but you've been manipulating them to get money you don't even need. And they were so eager to support you that they never questioned a word you said. My grandmother's voice echoed in my memory. Your strength is a gift, Scarlett. It should be honored, not punished. David Miller handed me another envelope, this one sealed and addressed to my parents. Mrs. Caldwell anticipated that Eleanor and Richard might contest these inheritance arrangements. She left this letter as her final word, with instructions that if there are any legal challenges to Scarlett's inheritance, additional information will be made public. Both of my parents went pale. They knew Victoria well enough to understand that she never bluffed. I gathered the documents, my hands steadier now. The shock had burned away, leaving something harder in its place, something that felt like clarity. What do you want from us, Scarlett? My father asked, and for the first time in my life, he sounded old. I looked at each of them in turn. My mother, who had always made me feel like my accomplishments were just what was expected. My father, who had praised my independence while using it as an excuse to give me less. My brother, who had taken and never once said it wasn't fair. I want honesty, I said. I want you to admit that you've treated Ethan and me differently our entire lives, and I want you to acknowledge that being independent doesn't mean I deserve less love or support. My mother's eyes filled with tears. We never meant to make you feel unloved, Scarlett. We were proud of your strength and independence. Being proud of my strength while punishing me for it are two different things, I said. You gave Ethan every advantage, every safety net, every second chance. You gave me expectations and the assumption that I would meet them without any help. Ethan finally found his voice. I'm sorry, Scarlett, I know this isn't fair. I should have said something years ago. Why didn't you? He looked at his hands. Because I was scared. I knew I wasn't as capable as you, and I was afraid of failing without Mom and Dad's support. It was easier to let them keep helping me than to admit I should be standing on my own. The admission hung in the air between us. At least it was honest. I collected my grandmother's documents, the deeds and statements, and that precious letter that validated everything I'd felt but never been able to name. I need time to decide how I want to handle the properties and investments. David, can we schedule another meeting next week? As I stood to leave, my mother reached for my hand. Scarlett, will you still come to Sunday dinner this week? I looked down at her. This woman who had given birth to me, raised me, and somehow convinced herself that loving me meant expecting me to need nothing. I don't know, I said honestly. I need time to figure out who I am now that I know the truth about everything. I walked out of that conference room carrying a folder full of documents that represented financial security I'd never expected. But more than that, I carried the validation of knowing that at least one person had seen the injustice and cared enough to do something about it. 3 weeks later, I found myself driving through Seattle in a Honda Civic I'd bought with cash from my grandmother's trust. The city streets were wet with early spring rain, and I was on my way to inspect my inherited properties. My phone rang as I waited at a stoplight. Ethan's name flashed on the screen. Scarlett, I need to talk to you. His voice sounded strained. Mom and Dad are asking about the restaurant's finances. They want to see the actual books, not just my summaries. I felt a grim satisfaction settle in my chest. The truth has a way of coming out, Ethan. You spent years taking money you didn't need while they convinced themselves I didn't deserve support because I was too strong. I know it was wrong. They hired an accountant to review everything, just like Grandma hired that investigator. I don't know what to do. Tell them the truth, I said simply. That's what you should have done years ago. I ended the call and pulled up to the commercial building downtown. Inside, I met with the founders of a tech startup who were renting office space. The monthly income from this property alone exceeded my old salary at Sundale Financial. My grandmother had been brilliant with money, and she'd wanted me to have this. Not because I needed saving, but because I deserved it. The following Sunday, I drove to my parents' house. The driveway looked the same, the garden perfectly manicured, the house that had held so many uncomfortable family dinners waiting with its usual stolid presence. I sat in my car for 5 minutes before I could make myself go inside. The atmosphere was thick with tension. My mother had cooked pot roast, my childhood favorite, as if familiar food could somehow bridge the gap that had opened between us. My father poured wine with shaking hands. Ethan sat in his usual chair, looking like he hadn't slept in days. "How are the properties?" my father asked, making conversation like we were strangers at a networking event. "Profitable," I said. "Grandma was an excellent investor." My mother set down her fork with a sharp click. We had no idea Victoria had accumulated so much wealth. She always seemed so frugal. "Frugal is how you build wealth, Mom. Grandma understood the difference between spending money and investing it." Ethan took a deep breath. "I need to tell you both something. I've decided to return the money you gave me from your estate." Both of my parents looked shocked. My father started to protest. "No," Ethan said, and there was something different in his voice. Something firmer. "It's not a gift. It's Scarlett's inheritance that you gave to me. She deserves her fair share, and I genuinely don't need it for the restaurant." I looked at my brother, really looked at him, and saw something I hadn't expected. Shame, yes, but also the first signs of a backbone I'd never known he had. "I appreciate the gesture, Ethan," I said carefully. "But keep the money. Use it to expand your restaurant properly, without lying about your financial situation. What I want is honesty about how our family actually works." My mother pushed her plate away. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I want you to acknowledge that you've always treated us differently and make conscious choices about whether you want to continue doing that." The dinner continued in tense silence, punctuated by careful conversation and unspoken apologies. It wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary. It was the foundation of something new, something built on truth instead of convenient fictions. Over the following months, I watched Ethan's empire crumble under the weight of his own lies. The accountant my parents hired discovered he'd been inflating expenses and understating income for years to justify their financial support. Their trust in him broke completely. They stopped providing the safety net he'd relied on for so long. Without the cushion of parental rescue, Ethan had to face his own poor business decisions and lack of financial discipline. The restaurant failed, not because of market conditions, but because he'd never learned to operate responsibly. He moved back in with my parents, taking a job as a line cook at another restaurant while slowly paying down his debts. I felt no satisfaction watching his collapse. Only a kind of sad vindication that the system that had propped him up had finally stopped functioning. My parents faced their own reckoning. The family dynamic they'd taken for granted had changed irrevocably. They struggled to understand how protecting Ethan had actually weakened him, while their harsh treatment of me had been a form of neglect dressed up as confidence in my abilities. They started attending family therapy, trying to unpack the damage their unconscious biases had caused. My mother cried a lot during those sessions. My father sat with his hands folded, looking older every week. The trust that had been broken would take years to rebuild, if it could be rebuilt at all. But I had work to do that didn't involve fixing my family's dysfunction. I left Sundale Financial to manage my properties full-time. The trust my grandmother had established gave me the freedom to make choices based on what I wanted, not what I needed to survive. I expanded my real estate portfolio, invested carefully, and started a mentorship program for young women starting their own businesses. I thought about my grandmother often during those months of transformation. She'd been right about everything. Strength should be honored, not punished. Capability should be celebrated, not used as an excuse to give someone less. One evening, I stood on the roof deck of the commercial building in Seattle, watching the sun set over the city. The properties were in my name now. The trust was mine to manage. The future stretched out before me, full of possibilities I'd built with my own hands but finally had the resources to realize. I pulled out my phone and opened the voice memo app. I'd been recording my thoughts lately, trying to process everything that had happened. Trying to understand the woman I'd become in the aftermath of that terrible, transformative Tuesday in the law office. Looking back on those crucial weeks, I said into the phone, my voice carried away by the wind, I realized that the greatest revenge wasn't financial success or family drama. It was living authentically and refusing to accept less than what I deserved, even from people who claimed to love me. Below me, the city lights began to flicker on, one by one, illuminating the darkness. I thought about the girl I'd been, working 3 jobs and believing that if she just tried hard enough, her parents would see her the way they saw Ethan. I thought about the woman I was now, standing on property she owned, building a life defined by her own choices instead of other people's expectations. My grandmother had given me more than money. She'd given me permission to demand better, to set boundaries, to recognize that I deserved support and love and inheritance, not in spite of my strength, but as a celebration of it. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, and I realized I was smiling. Not the tight, controlled smile of someone trying to prove she didn't need anything, but the genuine smile of someone who had finally learned that needing and deserving weren't signs of weakness. They were signs of being human. And I deserved every bit of what my grandmother had left me, not because I needed saving, but because I had always been worth saving. That truth, More than any property deed or bank statement was the real inheritance Victoria Caldwell had left behind. But the story didn't end there. 2 months after that rooftop moment, I received a call from David Miller. His voice carried an urgency I'd never heard before. "Scarlett, you need to come to my office immediately. There's been a development." When I arrived, he handed me another envelope. This one had been in my grandmother's safety deposit box, with instructions that it'd only be released 6 months after her death. Inside was a recording, a small digital audio file, and a note in her handwriting, for when they try to rewrite history. I pressed play. My grandmother's voice filled the room, but she wasn't alone. I heard my mother's voice, clear as day, from a family dinner 3 years ago. "We need to make sure Scarlett doesn't expect anything," Eleanor was saying. "She's always been so independent. If we give her money, it might make her soft. Ethan needs us. He's always needed us." My father's voice joined in. "Victoria keeps asking about our estate plans. We should tell her we're splitting everything equally, but we don't actually have to do that. Scarlett will be fine. She always is." There were hours of recordings, conversations where they discussed how to justify excluding me, debates about whether I would even notice if they gave everything to Ethan. Laughter about how I was too proud to ask for help anyway. My grandmother's voice came through at the end of the recording, speaking directly into the device. "Scarlett, I recorded these so you would never doubt yourself, so you would know that what you felt was real. They chose this. Remember that when they try to make you feel guilty for accepting what I've given you." I sat in David's office, tears streaming down my face, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of validation, of rage, of relief that I wasn't crazy, that the years of feeling invisible hadn't been my imagination. That evening, I forwarded the recording to my parents with a single message: "Grandma heard everything, and now I have proof." My phone exploded with calls. I didn't answer any of them. Let them sit with their own words. Let them hear themselves plotting to erase me from my own family's legacy. The next Sunday dinner was going to be very different indeed.